The cold autumn wind blew through the trees as Shanice Taylor pulled her blue hoodie tighter around her shoulders. School had been tough that day. 3 tests and a heated debate competition where her team had barely won. But they did win, and that was something to celebrate, even if it was just with a chocolate shake and some fries at McDonald's. The golden arches glowed bright against the darkening sky as Shanice pushed through the glass doors. The familiar smell of French fries and burgers hit her right away. The place was packed, noisy with after-school crowds, families grabbing early dinners, and workers stopping for coffee before night shifts. Shanice joined the line, scrolling through messages from her mom. "We'll be home by 7, she typed quickly. Just grabbing a snack first. Her debate coach had praised her closing argument today. That felt good, especially since she'd stayed up until midnight working on it. "Next customer, please," called the cashier, a tired-looking older woman with kind eyes. "Hi, can I get a medium chocolate shake and a small fries?" Shanice asked, counting out exact change from her wallet. Her parents had taught her to be precise with money, a habit that had earned her the role of treasurer in 3 different school clubs. The cashier handed Shanice her receipt. "It'll be ready in just a minute, honey." While waiting, Shanice scanned the restaurant for a place to sit. The football team had claimed most of the large tables, their boisterous laughter drowning out the pop music playing through overhead speakers. A few business people tapped on laptops in the corner booths. Finally, Shanice spotted a small table near the window. Perfect. She could watch people pass by while reviewing her history notes. The test tomorrow covered the civil rights movement, a topic she felt personally connected to through stories her grandparents had shared. "Order 127, called out another worker, sliding Shanice's tray across the counter. "Thank you," she said with a smile, carefully navigating through the crowded dining area to reach her table. The first sip of chocolate shake was exactly what she needed. Cold, sweet relief after a long day. Shanice pulled her history textbook from her backpack and flipped to Chapter 8. The pages were already marked with colorful sticky notes, her system for organizing important dates and quotes. 2 tables away, an elderly white woman with silver hair fumbled with her purse while trying to eat her fish sandwich. She kept looking around nervously, adjusting her glasses. Shanice barely noticed her, focused instead on memorizing key Supreme Court decisions from 1954 to 1968. The restaurant's noise faded into background hum as Shanice lost herself in her studies. This was her routine, finding pockets of time between activities to stay on top of her coursework. Her parents couldn't always help with homework, both working long hours at the hospital, so she'd learned to manage her time carefully. Outside, red and blue lights suddenly flashed across the window. A police car had pulled into the parking lot. Shanice glanced up briefly, then returned to her notes, highlighting a passage about nonviolent resistance. At the counter, the restaurant manager leaned in close to speak with the elderly woman, who was gesturing frantically toward Shanice's direction. Neither of them actually looked directly at her, but rather toward her general area. The evening continued normally for Shanice. She dipped fries in ketchup, occasionally pausing to text her debate teammates about their victory. She had no idea she was being watched. No idea that in just minutes, her whole life would change. The door swung open, and 2 police officers entered the restaurant. Their eyes scanned the crowd before locking onto Shanice's table. They moved with purpose, hands resting near their equipment belts. And Shanice, still lost in the pages of history, had no idea that she was about to become part of a story that would ripple through her community, a story that began with a simple misunderstanding and a chocolate shake on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Mrs. Henderson clutched her empty purse, her wrinkled hands shaking slightly. She was sure she'd brought her wallet. She always kept it in the side pocket, right next to her heart medication. But now the pocket was empty and panic was setting in. "Excuse me," she called out to a young employee wiping down a nearby table. "I need to speak with your manager right away." The teenager nodded and disappeared behind the counter. Minutes later, a man in a crisp McDonald's uniform approached her table. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" he asked, his name tag reading Doug. "No, it's not okay. My wallet is gone," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice rising. "I had it when I ordered my food. I know I did. And now it's gone." Doug's face shifted to concern. Did you check under the table or your seat? Sometimes things slip. I've looked everywhere, she interrupted, growing more agitated. Someone must have taken it when I wasn't looking. Her eyes darted around the crowded restaurant suspiciously. Can you remember who was near you? Doug asked, trying to keep his voice calm as other customers began to glance over. Mrs. Henderson scanned the restaurant, her memory fuzzy. She'd been sitting here for nearly an hour. Several people had come and gone from nearby tables. Then her eyes settled on the far corner. That girl, she said, pointing vaguely toward the area where Shanice was studying. The one in the blue. She walked by my table earlier. In reality, 3 different teens in the restaurant were wearing blue, and none had passed directly by Mrs. Henderson's table. Doug frowned, following her gaze. He saw Shanice, headphones in, completely focused on her textbook. She didn't look suspicious at all, but Mrs. Henderson seemed convinced. I had almost $50 and all my cards in that wallet, Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice quivering. My late husband's photo was in there too. Doug hesitated. He didn't want to accuse an innocent customer, but he also couldn't ignore an elderly woman's distress. Company policy was clear about theft reports. Let me call the police so you can file a report, he said finally. They can help sort this out. While Mrs. Henderson nodded gratefully, Doug walked to the back office to make the call. Through the window, he watched Shanice. She was just sipping her shake and flipping pages like any other student. Police department, what's your emergency? A voice answered. This isn't exactly an emergency, Doug explained. But we have a customer who believes her wallet was stolen at our McDonald's on Maple Street. Does she know who took it? Doug paused. She thinks she does, but I'm not sure. She's pointing to a teenage girl, but honestly, the girl doesn't seem to be doing anything suspicious. We'll send someone to check it out, the dispatcher replied. Officers should arrive in about 5 minutes. Meanwhile, at her table, Shanice remained lost in her studies, occasionally typing notes into her phone. A group of boys from her school walked past, laughing loudly about something that had happened in gym class. One of them waved at her, but Shanice barely noticed, determined to finish her chapter before heading home. Near the entrance, Mrs. Henderson kept glancing nervously toward Shanice's direction. In her mind, she became increasingly certain this was the person who had taken her wallet. When she'd first arrived at the restaurant, hadn't there been a girl in blue near the condiment stand? That must have been when it happened. Doug returned, offering Mrs. Henderson a free coffee while they waited. The police are on their way, he assured her. I'm sure they'll help figure this out. Outside, rain had started to fall, powdering against the windows. The restaurant lights reflected in the growing puddles of the parking lot. Shanice finally looked up from her book, noticing the weather change. She'd need to hurry home soon before the rain got worse. The sound of sirens approached in the distance, barely audible over the restaurant chatter. Mrs. Henderson straightened in her seat, clutching her empty purse like it was evidence. And Shanice, completely unaware, pulled out her phone to text her mom that she was almost done with her studying. Neither of them realized that their lives were about to collide in ways that would change both of them forever. The police cruiser pulled into the McDonald's parking lot, splashing through puddles as the rain came down harder. Officers Davis and Wilson stepped out, adjusting their rain jackets before heading inside. The smell of wet asphalt mixed with the warm food scents as the glass door swung open. Doug immediately approached them, speaking in hushed tones. Thanks for coming so quickly. The woman who reported the theft is over there. He pointed to Mrs. Henderson, who waved them over anxiously. And the person she suspects? Officer Wilson asked, scanning the restaurant. Doug hesitated. She thinks it's the girl in the blue hoodie in the corner, but honestly, I'm not sure. The girl's been studying the whole time. Officer Davis nodded. We'll talk to the elderly lady first, get her statement. They approached Mrs. Henderson, who clutched at Officer Wilson's sleeve as soon as he was close enough. Thank goodness you're here, she said. My wallet has all my medication information and my late husband's photo. It's the only one I carry. Can you tell us what happened, ma'am? Officer Davis asked, pulling out a small notepad. Mrs. Henderson explained how she'd ordered her meal, paid with cash from her wallet, and then put the wallet back in her purse. When I went to get my senior discount card to show the cashier, it was gone. Someone must have taken it when I wasn't looking. And you believe it was that young lady? Officer Wilson clarified, glancing toward Shanice. I'm certain of it, Mrs. Henderson insisted, though her voice wavered. She was near the condiment station when I was putting sugar in my coffee. That must have been when she took it. Officer Davis frowned. Did you see her take anything from your purse? Well, no, Mrs. Henderson admitted, but who else could it be? The officers exchanged looks. This wasn't much to go on, but they couldn't dismiss an elderly woman's concerns, especially when she was so distressed. We'll speak with her, Officer Davis decided. Maybe she saw something. They walked across the restaurant, past tables of customers who had begun to notice the police presence. Conversations quieted as heads turned to watch. Shanice didn't notice the approaching officers until their shadows fell across her table. She looked up, startled, pulling out her earbuds. Excuse me, miss, Officer Wilson said firmly. We need you to stand up slowly and put your hands where we can see them. Confusion washed over Shanice's face. Me? Why? What's happening? Please stand up, Officer Davis repeated, his hand resting on his belt. This will go easier if you cooperate. Shanice's heart hammered in her chest as she slowly rose, that history book falling closed. I don't understand. What did I do? By now, the restaurant had gone silent. Everyone was watching. Shanice felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and fear. We're investigating a theft, Officer Wilson explained, his voice carrying across the quiet restaurant. A wallet was taken, and we need to ask you some questions. A wallet? Shanice's voice cracked. I didn't take anyone's wallet. I've been sitting here studying for my history test. Officer Davis stepped closer. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, please. You're arresting me. Shanice's eyes widened in disbelief. For what? I didn't do anything. Despite her protests, Officer Davis took her wrists and pulled them behind her back. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked into place. The sound seemed to echo through the restaurant. Phones came out as other customers began recording. A group of teenagers from Shanice's school watched in shocked silence. One girl covered her mouth, whispering, "That's Shanice from debate team." "We found your wallet, Mrs. Henderson." A voice suddenly called from across the restaurant. A young employee held up a black leather wallet, his face relieved. It was stuck between the cushion and the side of the booth. But the officers didn't hear him over the growing murmurs of the crowd. Officer Wilson had already begun reading Shanice her rights, while tears welled in her eyes. "Please," she begged, her voice small but clear in the hushed restaurant. "Call my parents. This is a mistake. I didn't take anything." As they began leading her toward the door, Shanice caught Mrs. Henderson's eye. The older woman's confident accusation had melted into uncertainty as she watched the teenager's tears. And somewhere in the back of the restaurant, a security camera silently recorded everything, capturing a moment of injustice that would soon be revealed for exactly what it was: a terrible mistake. The rain fell harder as the glass doors of McDonald's swung open. Shanice stepped outside, flanked by Officers Davis and Wilson. The handcuffs bit into her wrists, cold and tight against her skin. Every eye in the restaurant followed her exit, and Shanice had never felt so small. "Watch your step," Officer Wilson said as they approached the curb, his hand on her elbow. Lightning flashed in the distance, briefly illuminating the parking lot. "Please," Shanice tried again, her voice trembling. "This is a mistake. I didn't take anyone's wallet. I was at debate practice until 5:30. I have witnesses." Officer Davis sighed. "You can explain everything down at the station. Right now, we need to search your backpack." They stopped beside the patrol car, its red and blue lights painting Shanice's face in alternating colors. Officer Wilson set her backpack on the hood of the car and unzipped it. "Be careful with my history book," Shanice said quietly as he pulled out her textbooks one by one. "I'd borrowed it from the library." The contents of her life spilled across the police car's hood, notebooks filled with careful handwriting, a calculator with college acceptance stickers, a half-empty water bottle, a small makeup bag, and a sandwich container with a note from her mom that read, "Good luck at debate. Love you." There was no wallet, no stolen money, nothing that didn't belong to a hard-working high school student. Behind them, a crowd had gathered at the McDonald's windows, faces pressed against the glass. Some were filming with their phones. Shanice recognized classmates among them, their expressions a mix of shock and confusion. Tomorrow, everyone at school would know. The thought made her stomach twist. "That's everything," Officer Wilson announced, looking uncomfortable as he found nothing suspicious. "We'll still need to take you in for questioning." Just then, the McDonald's doors burst open, and Doug the manager ran out, waving his arms. "Officers, wait," he called, hurrying across the wet parking lot. "There's been a mistake." Mrs. Henderson found her wallet. It was stuck in the booth seat the whole time. Officer Davis turned, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Doug insisted, slightly out of breath. "She just opened it and confirmed everything's there. All her cards, her cash, even her husband's photo. It must have slipped out when she was sitting down." Shanice felt tears of relief threatening to spill. "I told you," she whispered. "I told you I didn't take anything." The officers exchanged awkward glances. Officer Wilson cleared his throat. "We were just following procedure, miss. We had a complaint and you didn't even check the security cameras before putting me in handcuffs." Shanice's voice rose slightly, strength returning. "You didn't think maybe you should investigate first?" From the McDonald's doorway, Mrs. Henderson appeared, clutching her found wallet. Her face had crumpled with regret as she watched the scene unfold in the rain. Slowly, she approached the group. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice small against the patter of raindrops. "I was so sure. I didn't mean to. I just thought." Shanice couldn't look at her. The damage was already done. Her clothes were soaked, her wrists hurt from the handcuffs, and tomorrow, videos of her arrest would likely be all over social media. "Can you please take these off now?" she asked, turning slightly to indicate the handcuffs. Officer Davis quickly removed them, revealing red marks where they had dug into their skin. "We apologize for the inconvenience, miss," he said stiffly. Inconvenience. The word hung in the air, inadequate and hollow. Doug handed Shanice her backpack, carefully repacked. "Your meal's on the house from now on," he said quietly, "whenever you come in." Shanice took her backpack, rubbing her wrists. The rain had soaked through her hoodie, and she shivered slightly. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably her mom wondering why she wasn't home yet. How would she explain this? "Do you need a ride home?" Officer Wilson offered, guilt evident in his voice. Shanice shook her head. "No, thank you. I'd rather walk." She needed time to process what had just happened, time to figure out what to tell her parents, time to prepare for facing her classmates tomorrow. As she turned to leave, a final flash of lightning illuminated the scene, a teenage girl walking away alone in the rain, her shoulders straight despite everything, while three adults watched in silence, the weight of their mistake hanging heavy in the stormy air. Officer Rodriguez tapped his pen against the desk, watching the security footage for the third time. The McDonald's cameras had captured everything. Mrs. Henderson sitting down with her tray, placing her purse beside her, and the wallet clearly slipping out and disappearing between the booth cushions when she shifted to reach for her drink. The footage also showed Shanice entering the restaurant a full 20 minutes after this happened. There was no interaction between them, no opportunity for theft. Just a young girl buying a shake and fries, finding a table, and opening her textbook. "This should never have happened," Officer Rodriguez muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. Across the station, Shanice sat alone in a small interview room. They'd given her a blanket for her wet clothes and a cup of hot chocolate that sat untouched on the table. The clock on the wall showed 7:45 p.m. Her parents would be frantic by now. The door opened, and Officer Rodriguez entered with a folder. His face was kind but serious. "Miss Taylor," he began, sitting across from her. "I've reviewed the security footage from McDonald's. It clearly shows that Mrs. Henderson's wallet fell between the booth cushions before you even arrived at the restaurant." Shanice nodded slightly but said nothing. "I want to personally apologize for what happened today," he continued. "Officers Davis and Wilson should have investigated more thoroughly before taking action. They didn't even ask me any questions." Shanice finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "They just assumed I was guilty because some old lady pointed at me." Officer Rodriguez couldn't argue with that. "You're right. And that's not how we're supposed to handle situations like this." Shanice looked up, meeting his eyes. "Is it because I'm black?" Would they have handcuffed a white girl without checking the cameras first? The question hung in the air between them. Officer Rodriguez didn't have a good answer. After 20 years on the force, he knew these things happened too often to be coincidence. That's a fair question, he admitted, and one that our department needs to address. What happened to you today was wrong on multiple levels. He slid a form across the table. This is an official record that you were wrongfully detained. You were never formally charged with anything. This documentation might be important for you and your parents to have. The phone on the wall rang, and Officer Rodriguez answered it. Yes, they're here. Sent them back. He turned to Shanice. Your parents have arrived. Relief washed across her face for the first time that evening. Moments later, the door burst open. Shanice's mother rushed in, still wearing her hospital scrubs, and gathered her daughter into a fierce hug. Her father followed, his eyes moving from Shanice to Officer Rodriguez with a controlled anger that spoke volumes. What happened? Mr. Taylor demanded. We got a call saying our daughter was detained. For what? Officer Rodriguez explained the situation while Mrs. Taylor kept her arm around Shanice's shoulders as if to shield her from further harm. So you're telling me she was handcuffed and searched in public for a wallet that was never missing in the first place? Mr. Taylor's voice rose. And nobody bothered to check the security footage first. You're absolutely right to be upset, Officer Rodriguez acknowledged. This should never have happened. The officers involved will face an internal review. Internal review? Mrs. Taylor scoffed. My daughter was humiliated in front of her classmates. She was treated like a criminal when she was just studying for a test. Shanice touched her mother's hand. Mom, I just want to go home. Officer Rodriguez nodded. You're free to go. But before you do, I want you to know that I'll be personally recommending changes to our protocols. What happened today was unacceptable. As they stood to leave, Mr. Taylor paused. My brother is an attorney. You'll be hearing from him. Officer Rodriguez handed him his card. I expected as much. And for what it's worth, I think you should. Some mistakes need to be addressed in court to ensure they don't happen again. Shanice gathered her still damp backpack, the red marks from the handcuffs visible on her wrists as she reached for it. Shanice, Officer Rodriguez said as they reached the door, I'm truly sorry. She looked back at him, her eyes older and wiser than they had been just hours before. Sorry doesn't fix this, she said simply, but making sure it doesn't happen to someone else might. The door closed behind them, leaving Officer Rodriguez alone with that truth and the security footage still playing silently on his computer screen. The front door of the Taylor family home had barely closed behind them when Shanice's phone buzzed with notifications. Videos of her arrest were already spreading online. Her classmates had shared the footage, and local community groups were picking it up, adding angry captions about police harassment. Turn it off, her father said gently, watching her scroll through the comments with a pained expression. You don't need to see all that right now. Shanice set her phone face down on the coffee table. Her mother brought her a mug of real hot chocolate, not the watery police station kind, topped with tiny marshmallows like she used to make when Shanice was little. Do you want to talk about it? Mrs. Taylor asked, sitting beside her on the couch. Shanice wrapped her hands around the warm mug. Not really, but I have to, don't I? Everyone's going to be talking about it tomorrow. The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Mr. Taylor opened it to find Officer Rodriguez standing on their porch, holding a thick envelope. I apologize for coming to your home, he said, but I wanted to deliver this personally. Shanice's father didn't invite him in. What is it? The official police report, amended to show no wrongdoing on Shanice's part. Also, a formal letter of apology from the department and the security footage from McDonald's. Officer Rodriguez held out the envelope. I thought you might want these documents for your records or for your attorney. From the living room, Shanice could hear every word. She set down her mug and walked to the door. You drove all the way here just to drop off papers? She asked, standing beside her father. Officer Rodriguez met her eyes directly. No. I came to tell you in person that both Officers Davis and Wilson have been placed on administrative leave pending a full review, and to let you know that the police chief would like to meet with you and your family tomorrow, if you're willing. Shanice exchanged looks with her father, who crossed his arms. Meet for what purpose? To discuss what happened and what changes need to be made, Officer Rodriguez explained. He's taking this very seriously, especially now that the videos are getting attention. So this is about damage control? Mrs. Taylor asked, joining them at the door. Officer Rodriguez shook his head. For some at the department maybe, but for others, including myself, it's about making sure this doesn't happen again. Shanice asked me a hard question today about whether this would have happened to a white student. That question deserves an honest answer and honest action. The sincerity in his voice was hard to dismiss. After a moment, Mr. Taylor accepted the envelope. We'll consider meeting with the chief, he said, but our attorney will be present. Officer Rodriguez nodded. Of course. And there's one more thing. He turned to Shanice. Mrs. Henderson asked if she could write you a letter. She wanted to apologize in person, but I suggested giving you some space first. Shanice hadn't expected that. The angry part of her wanted nothing to do with the woman who had caused all this trouble. But another part remembered the regret on Mrs. Henderson's face in the rain. I'll read her letter, she said finally. After Officer Rodriguez left, the family gathered around the kitchen table. Mr. Taylor called his brother, the attorney, and put him on speakerphone as they reviewed the documents. They're scared, Uncle Philip said after hearing the details. Those videos don't look good for the department. That gives us leverage to push for real changes. What kind of changes? Shanice asked. That's partly up to you, her uncle replied. What do you want to come from this? Shanice thought about the question as she absently rubbed the fading marks on her wrists. What did she want? Money didn't seem like the answer. Neither did getting 2 officers fired, though they certainly deserved consequences. I want them to do better, she said finally. I want them to actually look at evidence before assuming someone's guilty. I want them to ask questions first. She paused, then added more firmly, and I want them to admit publicly that they treated me differently because I'm black. Her parents looked at her with a mixture of pride and sadness, pride at her thoughtfulness, sadness that at 16, their daughter had to navigate such injustice. Then that's what we'll push for, her father said, squeezing her shoulder. Starting tomorrow. 6 months later, Shanice stood at the podium in City Hall, adjusting the microphone. The chamber was packed with people, students, parents, community activists, and several police officers, including Officer Rodriguez. TV cameras lined the back wall. My name is Shanice Taylor, she began, her voice clear and steady. 6 months ago, I was wrongfully detained at McDonald's while studying for a history test. Today, I'm here to talk about what's changed since then and what still needs to change. In the front row, her parents watched with quiet pride. Beside them sat Mrs. Henderson, who had become an unexpected ally in the months following the incident. After sending her letter of apology, the elderly woman had asked to meet Shanice. That difficult first conversation had gradually led to understanding, then to collaboration. When I was handcuffed in front of my classmates, I felt helpless, Shanice continued. But that feeling didn't last. My family, my community, and eventually this city government helped me find my voice. The journey hadn't been easy. The meeting with the police chief had been tense at first, with the department initially offering just a formal apology and sensitivity training for the officers. But Uncle Philip had pushed for more, and the viral videos had created enough public pressure to force real action. Together with the police department, we created the Youth Police Dialogue program that's now running in 5 local high schools, Shanice explained, gesturing to a poster displaying the program logo she had designed. In these monthly sessions, students and officers talk openly about their experiences and perspectives. Both sides are learning that listening is the first step toward respect. Behind her on a large screen, photos showed teenagers and police officers in workshop sessions, breaking into small groups, even sharing meals together. One image showed Officers Davis and Wilson, now back on duty after retraining, sitting awkwardly at a table with students, clearly uncomfortable but present. The department has also revised their detention policies, Shanice continued. Officers must now check available evidence, like security footage, before handcuffing anyone for non-violent offenses. This simple change might have prevented what happened to me. She turned a page in her notes, taking a deep breath. The personal part was always hardest to share. But this story isn't just about policies, it's about people. Mrs. Henderson and I now visit middle schools together to talk about how quick judgments and assumptions can hurt innocent people. She glanced at the elderly woman, who nodded encouragingly. Her mistake and the officer's actions changed my life, but I decided to use that change for something positive. That decision hadn't come easily. For weeks after the incident, Shanice had struggled with anxiety, jumping when police cars drove by, avoiding McDonald's entirely. Her grades had slipped. Some nights, she'd wake up with the feeling of handcuffs still pressing into her skin. "The truth is, I'm still healing," she admitted. But helping create these programs has been part of that healing process. Every student who learns from my experience, every officer who thinks twice before making assumptions, that matters. The city council members nodded as she outlined the next phase of proposals, including a civilian review board for police complaints and expanded funding for the dialogue program. "I didn't choose to become an activist," Shanice said as she neared the end of her speech. "But sometimes life chooses your path for you. What matters is what you do with it." As she stepped away from the podium to applause, Shanice caught Officer Rodriguez's eye. He nodded respectfully. Their relationship wasn't exactly friendship, but it had become something important, a bridge between communities that needed to understand each other better. Outside City Hall, a familiar sign glowed in the distance, the golden arches of McDonald's. Shanice no longer avoided going there. In fact, she often held student meetings in that very restaurant, deliberately choosing the same corner table where she'd been studying that rainy night. She had reclaimed the space, just as she had reclaimed her story, transforming a moment of injustice into a movement for change that was bigger than herself, bigger even than the mistake that had started it all.